Thank you, Bruce. And thank you, everyone, for the opportunity to engage with you in conversation today, not only during this fireside chat, but also as a moderator on the next section on measurement. When we think about the intersection between civic engagement and health, I'll say that this is something that is not only professionally meaningful for me, but also personally meaningful in many ways. Professionally meaningful, not only in terms of my scholarship, my dissertation and more than 2 decades of work has been squarely in the realm of civic engagement, but also in the interface between civic engagement and public policy. But personally as well, as someone who is an immigrant to the United States, someone who naturalized and has gotten engaged in many ways, and seeing seeing some of the challenges that we face. One of the motivating questions for this entire session is to think about what it means to have a healthy democracy, and with both meanings of that term, right, in terms of the health, the civic health of our democracy and the ways that our democratic institutions may improve or exacerbate health inequity. So in looking at frameworks on civic engagement and their relationship to health, first up here is one that is often referenced, and this is from BARHI, the Bay Area Regional Health Inequities Initiative. This is something that's been developed over well over a decade. And what I've flagged here are a couple in those red boxes, a couple of places where civic engagement is called out. So this is not as deep a policy model and a power model the way that Daniel had just laid out in his political determinants of health. But civic engagement is clearly present when we think about the living conditions and the ways that civic engagement directly affect those living conditions, but also indirectly the way they affect those living conditions through advocacy, through the nonprofit sector, and the ways that institutional inequities then produce inequities in living conditions, which then have those downstream effects in terms of health behaviors, disease and injury, and mortality. Next slide. Now, what I'll do in my remarks is to dig deeper into that. My apologies. My throat's irritated for some reason today. 1 second. To dig deeper into that black box of what civic engagement means. And there's so many different ways of thinking about civic engagement. One is to think about engagement at the level of individual behavior. This is often the perspective that is done in political science, although there have been studies that have gone beyond the study of individual behavior to look at social groups, to look at political institutions and social organizations more generally, and what the implications are for civic engagement at an organizational level or an institutional level. But focusing first on the individual level, one of the hallmark indicators that is often used for civic engagement is voting and being registered to vote and turning out to vote. But as we see in the box on the right, there's so many different measures of civic participation that go beyond voting. And these can generally be grouped into 3 types of categories. One is formal political participation. So this includes voting, but also discussing politics with family and friends, posting about politics on social media, contacting public officials, and several other formal ways of being politically engaged. There are other types of civic engagement that are generally categorized as social activism or social movement participation. These include signing petitions, engaging in protests, boycotts, and other online actions. And then finally, there's a realm of activity that is civic volunteerism. So this includes volunteering without pay for community organizations, but also working to solve community problems and making charitable contributions. In terms of explaining variations in civic participation and inequities in civic participation, the scholarship generally has focused on individual background attributes. So this includes individual resources, skills, and attitudes that relate to civic participation. And then interpersonal influences. These include the provision of information, recruitment into civic engagement or lack of recruitment into civic engagement, and then mobilization into civic engagement. And then finally, there are a set of contextual factors that could either be enabling factors or barriers to participation. These include institutional rules, including restrictions on citizenship and age, absentee voting rules, early voting rules, etc. The media environment is also important, and we'll hear about a lot of that in the course of the next 2 days. Residential contexts also matter, employment context, and civic context. Next slide, please. Now, that's what I presented before was a look at civic engagement at the individual level and disparities or inequities that are measured at the individual level. Going one level up, you can also think about civic engagement, either inequality or inequity. There are differences between the two, at the level of community organization. Most simply, what this perspective provides, and this is drawing on work that I did with Irene Bloomrad over a decade ago, what this points out is that civic engagement might be unequal or inequitable, not only at the level of the individual or household, it often is unequal at the level of organizations. So put simply, not all civic organizations have the same degree of resources, the same degree of presence in the eyes of policymakers and other decision makers, or influence when it comes to influencing policy and practice. Next slide. Finally, we are also going beyond thinking about civic engagement, not only at the individual level or at the level of community organization and stratification at that level, but also thinking about civic engagement in terms of civic infrastructure. Infrastructure is getting a lot of attention this year especially, but often the focus is on physical infrastructure like roads, tunnels, and bridges, or digital infrastructure like broadband. But it's also important to think about the civic infrastructure. So these are, when you think about civic infrastructure, you can think about government agencies and the coordination either vertically from federal, state, and local, or horizontally, and that coordination with nonprofits, faith-based organizations, and corporations. It's also important to pay attention to community media that plays an important role, or educational institutions, including K-12 and higher ed, that play an important role in civic education. And then finally, the pillars of civil society, including our nonprofit, faith-based, and for-profit organizations that provide crucial leadership during challenging moments, including those that we face today. I'll leave it at that and look forward to the conversation.